Right, listener. So today we're going deep into network security.
Okay.
Specifically, we're talking about sniffing, which is basically how people can spy on internet traffic.
Right.
Now, it seems from the articles and notes you sent over that you're interested in both sides of this, eh?
How these attacks work, but also how to protect yourself against them.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really practical approach to understanding not just the techniques and tools, but also
what you can actually do yourself.
Right.
Hi, so before we get too far into this, can you give us a simple explanation of what sniffing actually is?
Sure.
So is it really like someone listening in on what you're doing online?
Yeah, I mean, the basic analogy of digital eavesdropping is pretty accurate.
Okay.
So every time you send an email, browse a website, or really do anything online,
your data is being broken down into little packets and sent across the network.
Okay.
And a sniffer is basically a program that can capture and analyze those packets as they travel. So
someone could see what you're doing.
So it's literally like someone's tapping into the wires and reading my data as it goes by?
Yeah, you can think about it that way.
That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
It can be, but it's important to understand there are different types of sniffing.
Okay.
There's passive sniffing and active sniffing.
Okay.
Passive sniffing is like if you were sitting in a coffee shop and overhearing
bits of a conversation.
Okay.
They're not directly targeting you, but then just listening to whatever's out there.
Okay.
Active sniffing is more targeted, like someone bugged your phone to listen in.
On your calls.
Oh, so they're specifically trying to get my Wi data.
Exactly.
They're actively trying to intercept your data.
Okay, got it.
So in both cases, they're seeing my data, but active sniffing means they're specifically after me.
That's right.
Okay, now you mentioned some specific tools in your notes.
Yes. Wireshark, TCP dump, Cane enable. These all have something to do with sniffing, right?
Yeah, those are some of the common tools that are used both by security professionals and by hackers.
They sound kind of intense, though.
They do, like something out of a movie.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're powerful tools and can be used for a lot of different things.
Can you give us a quick overview of each of them, like how they're actually used in the real world?
Sure.
Okay, so let's start with Wireshark.
Okay.
Wireshark is probably the most well-known sniffing tool out there.
Okay.
It's like a super powerful microscope for your network traffic.
No, you can use it to capture, filter, and analyze packets in great
detail.
So this is something that could be used by like a security professional, but also a hacker, right?
Exactly.
It depends who's holding the magnifying glass.
That makes sense.
Okay, what about TCP dump?
So TCP dump is a command line tool, so you have to use like text commands to operate it rather than
buttons in the user interface.
Okay.
It's very popular with more technical users who really like the power and efficiency.
Got it.
So it's less about like deep analysis and more about quickly capturing specific data from the... So Wireshark is for like the detailed investigator, and TCP dump is more
for the quick reconnaissance mission.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
All right. And then we have Canable. Now, this one definitely sounds like something from the bad guys.
Yeah.
Canable is known for its ability to perform ARP poisoning.
Okay.
And we'll get into that a little bit later.
But essentially what that lets an attacker do is manipulate network traffic so they can intercept sensitive
data.
But yeah, this one definitely sounds like treble.
Yes, it's a powerful tool.
Now, there's another term that came up in my research that I have to ask about.
Promiscuous mode.
Right.
I mean, that sounds a little scandalous even for cybersecurity.
It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it?
It does.
So promiscuous mode basically allows a network interface card, which
is the hardware in your computer that connects you to the network, to capture all traffic that's
passing through it, not just the data that's addressed to your computer.
Okay, so it's like turning your network card into a giant ear that's listening to every conversation
in the room.
So it's like eavesdropping, but on steroids.
Yeah, you could say that.
I can see how that would be super valuable to a hacker.
But couldn't it also be helpful for a network administrator who needs to
monitor traffic?
Absolutely.
So it's a double-edged sword, like many tools in cybersecurity.
Gotcha.
So it can be used for legitimate purposes like troubleshooting or network analysis.
Okay.
But in the wrong hands, it gives attackers a window into everything that's happening on the network.
Makes sense?
And that actually leads into something else I wanted to ask about.
Sure.
You know, some of the stuff traveling over networks is more vulnerable than other things.
Right.
My research mentioned something called vulnerable protocols.
SMTP, POP3, FTP.
These kept coming up.
Why are these protocols so vulnerable?
So a lot of these older protocols were designed in a time when security wasn't as much of a
Concern as it is today.
okay.
They often transmit data in plain text, which means anyone with a sniffer could just read the information.
As if they were reading a book.
Oh, wow.
Like imagine sending a postcard with your credit card number written on it.
That's basically what sending sensitive data with one of these protocols is like.
So if I were using one of these protocols and someone was sniffing my network, they could see my passwords, my
Emails, everything.
it potentially could.
That's not good.
So are there secure alternatives for these protocols?
What should people be using instead?
Yes, definitely.
So instead of those protocols, we have things like SSH, SSL, TLS.
Okay,
Those protocols encrypt the data that's being transmitted,
okay.
making it much, much harder for sniffers to intercept and understand it.
So it's like sending a letter in a locked briefcase instead of just an open envelope.
Exactly.
Got it.
Encryption is key here.
Encryption is one of the most powerful tools that we have in cybersecurity
Got it.
because it scrambles that information, making it unreadable without the proper key.
So even if I have what seems like a really simple network, there are actually a lot of potential.
Vulnerabilities,
Yeah,
especially if best practices aren't being followed.
right.
And before we even get into how to protect yourself, we need to talk about another layer of complexity,
Switch networks.
right?
My notes said that sniffing on those networks is harder.
Why is that?
So sniffing on switch networks is more challenging than on those older hub-based networks.
Okay,
Imagine a hub as being like a loudspeaker that broadcasts every message to everyone in.
the room.
Okay.
A switch is more like a private phone call where it's just connecting the sender and the receiver directly.
So a sniffer can't just sit there and listen to everything on a switch network.
Right.
The data is only being sent to specific devices.
But hackers always find a way, don't they?
They do.
So what are some of the ways that hackers can still sniff on these supposedly more secure?
Networks.
So your notes mentioned a few things.
MC spoofing, MC flooding, ARP poisoning.
Right.
Those ones sounded particularly sneaky.
It can be.
Let's start with MC spoofing.
I have a vague idea of what a mass C address is.
It's like a unique identifier for a device on the network, right?
It is.
But how does that tie into sniffing?
So with MC spoofing, what an attacker does is they disguise their own MC address.
To impersonate another device on the network.
Okay, and what that does is it tricks the switch into sending them traffic that was intended for.
The legitimate device.
So it's like using a fake ID to get into a club.
That's a good way to think about it.
That's pretty clever.
Okay, so what about mass C flooding?
That one sounds a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, so the idea behind ASCII flooding is to overwhelm the switch with a ton.
Of fake MC addresses.
Okay,
And what that does is it causes the switch to malfunction and basically revert.
back to that hub-like behavior.
Oh, so it's like causing a commotion so you can slip past security.
Yeah, kind of like creating a diversion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And then we have ARP poisoning.
Right?
That was the one that Canonical was good at.
Yeah.
So how does that one work?
So ARP poisoning is about manipulating the address resolution protocol, or EREP
ARP, which is used to map IP addresses to AMASI addresses on a...
network.
I got it.
So the attacker does is they send out these fake ARP messages to associate.
Their own IC address with the IP address of another device.
Typically, that other device is the default gateway.
So they're basically hijacking the communication by putting in false information.
Exactly.
So instead of going to the right place, the data is going to the attacker.
Right.
So it tricks the devices into sending their traffic to the attacker instead of.
The legitimate gateway.
And then the attacker can see all the data flowing through.
Yes.
Wow,
These are some pretty sneaky techniques.
they are.
I mean, it seems like it's a constant battle to stay ahead of the hackers.
It definitely can be, but the good news is there are ways to fight back.
Okay.
That's where the countermeasures come in.
All right, good, because I'm ready to start learning about how to build up my defenses.
And that's what we'll talk about next.
Awesome.
All right, so we've talked about what sniffing is, some of the tools hackers use, and even promiscuous
mode. But now I want to switch gears and talk about defense.
Okay.
How do we protect ourselves from all this?
That is the question, isn't it?
It is.
The good news is that there are very effective ways to protect your network from these attacks.
The best approach is to think about it like building a fortress.
Okay.
You want to have multiple layers of defense to make it as difficult as possible for an attacker
to get in.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about here?
What kind of defenses?
My notes mention network intrusion detection systems.
And IDs.
Are those part of our digital fortress?
They are.
They're like the guards that are patrolling the perimeter.
Okay, so they're like watchdogs. Always on alert.
Exactly.
Yeah, they constantly monitor the network for any suspicious activity.
So how do they actually work?
What are they looking for?
So they work by analyzing network traffic patterns.
Okay.
They're looking for anything unusual that might suggest an attack.
Okay.
So, for example, they could detect things like network cards running in promiscuous mode.
Which we talked about earlier.
We did. Remember, that can be a sign that someone is trying to capture all traffic.
It can.
So NIDS would flag that as suspicious.
So it's like it's looking for the telltale signs that someone's snooping around where they shouldn't be.
Right?
And they're also trained to recognize what we call signatures of known attacks.
Okay, so like those ARP poisoning attempts that we were discussing.
Right, so think about it as a security guard that studied the faces of all the known criminals.
Right.
So they're more likely to spot someone trying to sneak in.
Makes sense.
It's like having an early warning system in place.
It is, but technology is only part of the solution.
Right.
My research also mentioned physical security.
Absolutely.
That's important too.
Sometimes the simplest things are the most overlooked.
Yeah.
You know, securing your physical network is like making sure that the walls of your fortress are
strong.
Right.
And the gates are locked.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how sophisticated your digital defenses are if someone can just walk in and plug into your
network.
Hey, that's a good point.
It's easy to get so focused on the digital world that you forget about real-world vulnerabilities.
Absolutely.
So what are some things people can do to improve their physical security?
Well, it can be as simple as making sure that your networking equipment is stored
in a secure location.
Okay.
Not just sitting out in the open where anyone could get to it.
Makes sense.
Make sure your wireless access points are password protected and
that those passwords are strong.
Right.
Think about those access points, like the windows to your fortress.
Okay.
You don't want to leave them wide open.
Good point.
Those are all things that are easy to forget about.
They are.
I want to make sure we touch on encryption as well, because it seems like that's a really fundamental part of all
this.
Yeah, and my research definitely emphasized it.
When it comes to preventing sniffing attacks.
Encryption is one of the most effective ways to protect data as it's traveling across a network.
Okay.
So even if an attacker does manage to get a hold of my data,
they can't read it if it's encrypted.
Right.
It just looks like gibberish to them.
Perfect.
So those vulnerable protocols we talked about, like SMTP, POP3, and FTP, right?
They all send data in plain text.
But the secure alternatives like SSH, SSL, and TLS, they use
encryption to protect the data.
Exactly.
So it's like they're speaking a secret language that only the intended recipient can understand.
Yeah, good analogy.
And this move from IPv4 to IPv6, that's a step towards a more secure internet.
As well, right?
It is, because IPv6 has built-in support for IPsec, which is a very powerful
protocol that provides end-to-end encryption for network traffic.
So we're moving towards a more secure foundation for the internet itself, hopefully.
That's good to hear.
But even with encryption, there are still ways for attackers to sniff on switched networks, right?
There are.
We talked about MC spoofing, MC flooding, ARP poisoning.
Right.
Are there specific defenses against those techniques?
Yes, there are.
Let's start with network segmentation.
Okay, network segmentation.
Now, that was mentioned in my research, but I'm not totally sure what it is.
Can you explain that?
Sure.
So think about it like this.
You're dividing your fortress into separate compartments.
Okay,
So if one compartment is breached, the attackers can't easily move to the other compartments.
makes sense.
So with network segmentation, you're dividing your network into smaller, isolated segments.
So if an attacker does gain access to one segment, they can't easily spread to the rest of the network.
So it's like containing a fire within a single room.
Exactly.
So it can't spread to the whole building.
Right.
That's a smart strategy.
Okay, what about those other techniques?
MSC spoofing and MSC flooding.
So one effective countermeasure for those is port security.
Okay, port security.
I remember that term, but can you refresh my memory?
What is it and how does it help?
Sure.
So port security is a feature that allows you to control which devices can connect to a specific.
Switch port
Okay.
based on their MAC address.
Okay, so it's checking IDs.
Exactly.
It's like a bouncer, only letting in who's on the list.
Yeah, so it prevents MMA spoofing because it only allows devices with authorized MC.
Addresses to connect.
Got it.
And it also helps to prevent MC flooding because you can limit the number of devices that can connect to a single. So it's like a double whammy.
It is protects against both MSC spoofing and MIS flooding.
Exactly.
Okay, what about ARP poisoning?
How can we defend against that one too?
We can.
A technique called DHCP snooping is very effective against ARP poisoning.
Okay,
DHCP snooping,
that one sounds a little more technical.
can you break it down for me?
Sure.
So DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol.
Okay.
And that's the process that automatically assigns IP addresses to devices on the network. DHCP snooping acts like a security checkpoint for that DHCP traffic.
Got it.
So it verifies that those DHCP messages are coming from a legitimate DHCP server
Okay.
and not from an attacker who's trying to inject false information.
So it's like making sure the instructions are coming from a trusted source
Right,
before you actually do what they say.
exactly.
So it adds that extra layer of validation to the process.
Got it.
Makes it much harder for an attacker to poison the ARP cache.
So it really does seem like defending against sniffing attacks requires multiple layers.
It does.
We need technology like NIDS and DHCP Snoop, but also things like physical security,
And strong passwords.
right?
It's not about finding one magic solution.
Right?
It's about building that comprehensive defense system.
To cover all your bases
Exactly.
and hopefully stop attackers from even trying in the first place.
Hopefully,
It really feels like we've been playing a game of chess here, thinking a few steps ahead and trying.
to outsmart those attackers.
Yeah,
It's a constant back and forth.
we've covered so much in this deep dive we have.
I mean, everything from the basics of sniffing to some really complex techniques.
Right.
It's been fascinating, but I have to admit, it's also kind of a lot.
Yeah, it can be.
So where do you even start with all this?
Well, you don't have to be a cybersecurity expert overnight.
Okay, good.
The important thing is to be proactive.
Okay.
Start with the basics.
Hey, so start with the basics,
What are the most important things for our listener to remember?
the things they should do first.
I think the most important thing is just to be aware of the risks.
You know, you've taken a big step already by doing your research and understanding these concepts.
Right.
That awareness will help you make better decisions about your online activities.
Okay.
Awareness is key.
It's like knowing the rules of the road before you start driving.
Exactly.
But what about actual steps?
What can our listener do, like today, to be more secure?
Well, we talked about strong passwords.
Right.
That's always a good place to start.
Make sure you're using unique, complex passwords for all your online accounts.
Okay.
And think about using a password manager to keep track of everything.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
It's one of those things that everyone knows they should do, but it's easy to let it slip.
It is.
A password manager definitely makes things easier.
What else?
We also talked about physical security.
Right.
So think about your home network.
Yeah.
Is your router in a safe place?
Okay.
Are your wireless access points password protected?
Okay.
These are simple things that can make a big difference.
Right.
Those basic physical measures are so important,
It's like locking your front door.
but we often forget about them.
We do.
Okay,
So, any other quick wins our listener can focus on?
definitely make sure that your software is up to date.
Right?
Software updates often include security patches that fix vulnerabilities.
That could be exploited by attackers.
So it's like putting on a new suit of armor
Exactly.
to protect against the latest threats.
I know those updates can be annoying sometimes, but they really are important.
They are.
It's like getting your flu shot.
Yeah,
You know, it's a bit of a hassle, but it's worth it in the long run.
right.
What else?
And don't forget about those vulnerable protocols we talked about.
Right.
If you're still using those older protocols for things like email or file transfer,
Switch to the more secure options.
it's like choosing a safer route to your destination.
Yeah.
It might take a little bit more effort, but you get much better security.
Okay.
Anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they're trying to stay safe online?
Well, just remember that security is an ongoing process.
It's not a one-time thing.
The threats are always changing.
So you have to stay informed and adapt.
So keep learning and never let your guard down.
Exactly.
That's great advice.
Anything else?
You know, one final thought.
Okay,
Don't be afraid to ask for help.
right.
There are so many resources available online. Forums, blogs, security communities.
It's true.
So if you're not sure about something, don't hesitate to ask.
That's a great point.
There's no shame in asking for help, especially with something as complex as cybersecurity.
Right.
And there are so many people out there who love this stuff
There are.
and they're happy to help.
Exactly.
And the more we all learn and share with each other, the stronger we become as a community.
Well said.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Your expertise has been invaluable.
It's glad to be here.
And listener, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of the world of sniffing.
Yeah.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there.
Absolutely.